What happens when two racist cops think they've caught the perfect suspect, only to discover they just arrested their own boss? This is the story of Commander James Mitchell, a decorated 25-year police veteran who walked into his own police station on his first day as chief, and ended up in handcuffs before he even reached his office. It started at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would destroy two careers and change everything at the Metropolitan Police Department. Detective Marcus Williams was about to make the biggest mistake of his 12-year career, and he had no idea that the next 30 minutes would be recorded, uploaded, and viewed by millions of people who couldn't believe what they were watching. The call came in as a suspicious person report. Someone who, quote, didn't belong in this neighborhood had been spotted near the police station's employee parking garage. What the reporting officer didn't know was that the suspicious person was actually the new police chief, arriving early for his first day to observe his department's operations without fanfare. Detective Williams exchanged a look with his partner, Detective Ryan Torres, both men already reaching for their duty belts with the confidence of officers who believed they knew exactly what they were dealing with. In their minds, they were about to apprehend someone who clearly didn't belong in their territory, someone whose very presence seemed to confirm their worst assumptions about crime in their district. Commander Mitchell stepped out of his modest sedan, adjusting his expensive suit as he prepared for what should have been a routine first day. He had specifically chosen to arrive before the morning shift change, wanting to see how his new department operated when they thought nobody was watching. What he was about to discover would shock him to his core. The irony was devastating. Mitchell, with commendations from 3 different departments and a spotless 25-year record, was about to be treated like a common criminal by the very officers he was appointed to lead. But here's what made it even worse. Mitchell had been warned this might happen. His predecessor had quietly suggested that some officers in the department still harbored old-school attitudes about who belonged in positions of authority. Detective Williams stepped out of his patrol car, with the swagger of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon as he assessed what he saw as a clear threat to police property. The man in the parking garage was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with obvious confidence, but in Williams' experience, that confidence was exactly what made him dangerous. Torres positioned himself strategically to the left, cutting off any potential escape route while Williams took point. Their approach was textbook intimidation, designed to overwhelm and control someone they had already judged to be a threat. Neither officer paused to consider that their target's calm demeanor and expensive clothing might indicate he belonged there. Commander Mitchell watched the officer's approach and immediately understood the situation developing before him. 25 years in law enforcement had taught him to recognize the body language of cops who had already decided guilt before gathering evidence. Part of him wanted to end this immediately by showing his badge, but another part, the part trained to observe and assess, was curious to see exactly how bad this was going to get. The tension in the garage was thick enough to cut as Torres moved into flanking position while Williams prepared to make contact. Their confidence was absolute, their certainty unshakable. They had found someone who obviously didn't belong, and they were going to handle it by the book. Their book, which apparently included a lot of assumptions about who belonged where and why. Williams cleared his throat and spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and an explanation for why you're in a restricted area. This parking garage is for police personnel only, and unless you have business here, you're going to need to move along." The demand was delivered with the kind of aggressive professionalism that left no room for negotiation. Williams had used this tone hundreds of times with people he considered suspicious, people who had found themselves in places they didn't belong, people who needed to understand that he was in charge of this situation. Mitchell reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberately non-threatening as he retrieved his wallet. Every gesture was calculated to avoid escalation, even as he noted the officer's aggressive positioning and the assumptions underlying their entire approach. He was getting a masterclass in how his department treated people they didn't immediately recognize as belonging. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. As Detective Williams examined Mitchell's driver's license, looking for any sign of forgery or deception, He was holding the identification of the man who would decide his professional fate within the hour. The license showed an address in the upscale Riverside district, information that only deepened the officer's suspicion about what this well-dressed black man could possibly be doing at their police station at this ungodly hour. Torres stepped closer, his eyes scanning for weapons or signs of criminal intent, trusting the instincts that had kept him alive for 14 years on the street. Those same instincts were now screaming that something was wrong with this picture. That expensive suits and calm demeanor didn't belong in police parking garages at dawn, especially not on someone who looked like trouble. Mitchell, Williams said, looking up from the license with unchanged suspicion. This still doesn't explain what you're doing in our parking garage. Are you here to file a report? Because if so, you need to use the main entrance, and the desk sergeant won't be available for another hour. This area is off limits to civilians. The word civilians hit Mitchell like a physical blow. Here he was, a quarter-century police veteran, being categorized and dismissed by officers who would soon learn they were talking to their commanding officer. But Mitchell let it slide, understanding that this was providing him with invaluable insight into how his department operated when they thought nobody was watching. Mitchell considered revealing his position immediately, but something stopped him. This was his chance to see the real culture of his new command, to understand what citizens experienced when they encountered his officers. "I'm here on police business," he said simply, technically truthful but deliberately vague. Torres exchanged another look with Williams, the kind of wordless communication that develops between partners who have dealt with countless people trying to talk their way out of trouble. "Police business," Torres repeated, his skepticism obvious. "Sir, I'm going to need you to be more specific than that. We can't have unauthorized individuals wandering around a secure facility." The questions came faster now, more aggressive, designed to pin down exactly why Mitchell thought he belonged in their parking garage. Both detectives had shifted into interrogation mode, treating him as a security threat who needed to be controlled and contained before he could do whatever damage they assumed he was planning. Mitchell maintained his calm understanding that any sign of agitation would only confirm their suspicions. He was being judged on everything: his appearance, his speech, his body language, his very presence in a space they had decided he didn't belong in. "I have a meeting with the chief of police," he said finally, offering just enough truth to see how they would respond. Williams pulled out his phone to check the time, his expression growing more skeptical by the moment. "Miss Mitchell, it's not even 7 a.m., and the chief doesn't typically take meetings this early. Are you certain you have the right day? Because your story isn't adding up, and we're starting to think you might not be as truthful as you're pretending to be." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, and Mitchell realized his officers were now questioning not just his presence but his honesty. The situation was escalating beyond a simple security check into something that would require formal resolution, and the longer he allowed it to continue, the more devastating the eventual revelation would become. Torres stepped forward, his patience exhausted. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us into the station so we can verify your story. If you really have legitimate business here, then there will be records. But until then, you're in a restricted area without authorization, and that's a problem we need to resolve immediately." It was phrased as a request, but Mitchell recognized it as a lawful order. His officers were prepared to arrest him if necessary, to escort him into the building where his nameplate waited on the door and his official portrait hung on the wall. The irony was about to become a career-ending nightmare for everyone involved. As they walked toward the employee entrance, Mitchell caught sight of the American flag in the lobby and wondered how many other citizens had been subjected to the same assumptions and aggressive treatment he was experiencing. Today, he was learning that the greatest threat to police-community relations might not come from outside agitators, but from the biases and prejudices of officers who wore the badge. The lobby of the Metropolitan Police Department became the stage for what would become the most legendary incident in the department's history. Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork as three men approached, immediately recognizing the body language of officers bringing someone in for questioning. "What we got here, Williams?" Rodriguez asked, already reaching for the standard processing form. The man in the expensive suit didn't look like their typical arrestee, but Rodriguez had learned not to judge criminal intent by appearance alone. Found him in the employee garage, Williams explained, his confidence unshaken by the increasingly surreal nature of the situation. Claims he has a meeting with the chief, but his story doesn't check out. Figured we should verify his identity before we let him wander around the building. Rodriguez began filling out the civilian detention form, creating what would become a historical document once the truth came to light. Sir, I'm going to need your full name, date of birth, and current address for our records. Just standard procedure when we have someone on the premises who isn't immediately identifiable. Mitchell provided the information, watching as Rodriguez documented every detail of an encounter that would reshape departmental training for years to come. The sergeant's careful handwriting was creating an official record of the morning his colleagues arrested their own chief of police. As Rodriguez completed the paperwork, Torres positioned himself near the exit, ensuring their detainee couldn't simply walk away. It was professional, thorough, and completely appropriate for someone they genuinely believed posed a security risk. The problem wasn't their procedure, it was their assumptions about who that procedure should be applied to. Looks like we're going to have to wait, Rodriguez announced after calling upstairs with no answer. The chief's office won't be staffed for another hour, so we can't verify your appointment. You can wait in our civilian holding area, or you can reschedule whatever business you think you have here. The offer was polite but firm, and Mitchell understood the message. Submit to detention or abandon his legitimate business and leave. Neither option acknowledged that his presence might be entirely appropriate and authorized. But then footsteps echoed from the main corridor, and Lieutenant Sarah Chen appeared with an armful of case files. She paused mid-stride when she saw the scene unfolding, something about the detainee triggering recognition she couldn't quite place. Chen studied the man more closely, that nagging sense of familiarity growing stronger. There was something about his bearing, his composure, that suggested he was accustomed to being in control rather than being controlled. "What's the situation here?" she asked, setting down her file. As Williams began explaining, Chen found herself staring at the detainee, trying to reconcile familiar features with an impossible context. The man's face was composed but watchful, like someone observing rather than enduring the process around him. And then recognition hit like a lightning bolt. "Oh my God," Chen whispered, her case files slipping from nerveless fingers to scatter across the lobby floor. "Sir, are you Commander James Mitchell, the man who was appointed as our new chief of police?" The question detonated like a bomb in the lobby, and Mitchell finally allowed himself to drop the pretense that had carried him through the most educational 30 minutes of his career. "Yes, Lieutenant Chen," he said quietly. "I am Commander Mitchell, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. Detective Williams felt his career flash before his eyes as the magnitude of their mistake became clear. Torres took an involuntary step backward, as if distance might somehow lessen the catastrophe. Rodriguez stared at the detention form in his hands, a document that would become the most famous piece of paperwork in department history. What happened next would define Mitchell's entire tenure as chief. Instead of anger or recrimination, he chose to use this devastating embarrassment as a foundation for transformation. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, addressing Williams and Torres directly, "I don't hold you responsible for following security protocols. You encountered someone in a restricted area and responded appropriately." The words should have been reassuring, but both detectives understood they were witnessing something more than damage control. Their new chief was analyzing this incident as a case study in policing bias and assumption. "However," Mitchell continued, "this incident has highlighted issues we need to address as a department. The assumptions that led to this encounter, the automatic presumptions about who belongs where and why. These are conversations we must have." Detective Williams found his voice, strain evident in every word. "Chief Mitchell, sir, our actions were based solely on security concerns. We would have questioned anyone under those circumstances." Mitchell studied Williams carefully. "Detective, I believe you believe that's true. But I want you to think about this morning's events, about every assumption you made and conclusion you drew. Ask yourself whether every aspect of your response was truly based on security protocols alone." The challenge was gentle but unmistakable, inviting self-reflection rather than demanding confession. Real change, Mitchell understood, couldn't be imposed from above. It had to come from individual officers examining their own biases and blind spots. What happens now? Torres asked, the weight of potential consequences heavy in his voice. Are there going to be disciplinary actions? Mitchell's response would set the tone for his entire command. There will be no disciplinary action, he said, watching relief flood their faces. However, there will be training, department-wide training on unconscious bias, community policing, and effective communication. This incident will serve as our case study. What followed was unprecedented. Instead of retreating to his office in embarrassment, Mitchell spent the next hour in that lobby, engaging in the most honest conversation about policing that any of them had ever experienced. They discussed decision-making processes, hot-hit relations, and the invisible biases that could influence law enforcement encounters. When Captain Morrison arrived for the morning shift, he found his new chief surrounded by officers in animated discussion, transforming a potentially career-ending incident into an impromptu training session on police-community relations. Lieutenant Chen would later say that morning changed how she thought about leadership. Williams would credit the incident with forcing him to examine assumptions he hadn't known he was making. Torres would use the experience to become one of the department's most effective community policing officers. And Mitchell? He would always remember his first day not for the embarrassment of being detained, but for the opportunity it provided to build trust and open dialogue. The incident became legendary within the department, but more importantly, it became the foundation for a comprehensive reform initiative that transformed how the Metropolitan Police Department approached its relationship with the community. As news of the incident spread throughout the department, Mitchell found himself fielding calls from supervisors, administrators, and city officials who had heard various versions of the story. Each conversation became an opportunity to reinforce his message about learning from mistakes and using uncomfortable experiences as catalyst for positive change. The mayor's office was initially concerned about potential media fallout, but Mitchell assured them that the incident would be handled internally as a training opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter. Within a week, Mitchell had implemented the first phase of what would become the most comprehensive bias training program in the department's history. Every officer, from rookie patrol officers to seasoned detectives, would participate in scenarios designed to challenge assumptions and examine unconscious biases. The program included community members as facilitators, creating dialogue between police and residents that had never existed before. Detective Williams volunteered to be the first officer to share his experience publicly, speaking at community meetings about how the incident had forced him to examine his own biases and assumptions. His honesty and vulnerability created a bridge between the department and community members who had long felt marginalized by police practices. Williams discovered that admitting mistakes and showing genuine commitment to change could build trust more effectively than any public relations campaign. Detective Torres became an advocate for body cameras and transparency measures, arguing that recording police interactions protected both officers and civilians from misunderstandings and false accusations. He worked with community leaders to develop guidelines for police encounters that emphasized respect and dignity for all parties involved, regardless of race, class, or appearance. Sergeant Rodriguez redesigned the civilian intake process to include bias awareness checks, ensuring that assumptions about who belonged in police facilities were challenged before they could escalate into incidents. His forms and procedures became a model adopted by departments across the state, proving that systemic change could begin with simple modifications to existing protocol. Lieutenant Chen was promoted to captain within 6 months, largely due to her leadership during the incident and her subsequent work developing community policing initiatives. She credited Mitchell's handling of the situation with teaching her that real leadership meant turning problems into opportunities and mistakes into teachable moments. The story spread beyond the Metropolitan Police Department, eventually reaching law enforcement conferences and training academies nationwide. Mitchell was invited to speak about the incident at police leadership seminars, where he emphasized that the most effective police reforms often came from honest examination of uncomfortable truths rather than defensive denial of problems. Local community groups, initially skeptical of any police reform efforts, gradually began to engage with the department as they witnessed genuine changes in officer behavior and department culture. The monthly community meetings that grew out of the incident became a model for police community engagement, focusing on dialogue, accountability, and mutual respect. Years later, when Mitchell reflected on his career, he would often say that getting arrested by his own officers was simultaneously the most embarrassing and most valuable experience of his professional life. It taught him that leadership wasn't about avoiding difficult situations, but about finding growth and opportunity within them. The incident proved that sometimes the most significant changes begin with the most unexpected encounters, and that real transformation requires leaders willing to embrace discomfort in service of progress. The Metropolitan Police Department's reputation transformed from one marked by community tensions to one recognized for innovative approaches to bias training and community engagement. Other departments sent representatives to study their programs, and the incident that began as a career-threatening mistake became a case study in effective police leadership and reform. Detective Williams later said that the morning he arrested his chief was the day he truly learned what it meant to serve and protect, understanding for the first time that protection meant safeguarding dignity and respect as much as physical safety. Detective Torres credited the experience with teaching him that assumptions could be more dangerous than any weapon, and that real police work required examining his own biases as carefully as he examined crime scenes. The morning Commander James Mitchell got arrested by his own officers became the foundation story of a new era in police-community relations, proving that sometimes the most transformative leadership emerges from the most humbling experience, and that the strongest institutions are built by those willing to learn from their mistakes rather than hide from them. The incident would be referenced in police training manuals, academic studies on organizational change, and community organizing workshops for decades to come. But for those who lived through it, the real lesson was simpler, that respect and dignity weren't privileges to be earned, but rights to be protected, and that real change happened when people were willing